Some of these should be familiar. We're going to need a smoke object. We're going to need, and actually I kind of want to see that source so I can set the smoke object up. I'm going to put it at 0.5 here just because I know the size is 1. And so the center is 0.5. It's going to be resting right on the ground. So I'm going to drag this guy up to, looks like maybe around 12 is good. If we move it out, I don't know, something like maybe 10 wide is good, it looks like. Something like that. Cool. We know it's resting on the ground. I'm going to put this closed boundary business on. I'm just going to keep the negative y one checked. Negative y is, of course, this pane on the ground here. So it's going to say it's closed. What closed means that smoke can't travel out of it. What does that mean? Well, it's a ground plane. It's a very efficient ground plane that the solver has built into it, rather than actually introducing some sort of rigid body or even the ground plane top. So you might as well turn that on. Actually, while we're here, we're going to want to do, let's say 150 voxels vertically for now is probably pretty good. We'll definitely make that higher later. We'll go here. We'll go here. We do use the smoke object with the pyro solver, even though maybe you wouldn't think to. And we're going to actually have to source this thing into it. So I'm going to say source volume. Get it? We can actually hide this guy now because now we're going to source it in with this. He'll go here. I'm going to say source volume, fuel, and temp. And again, to reiterate, we're not going to add density into our simulation. Well, we're going to do it now, just so I can show you what I mean. But when we actually get going, we're not going to. So here it is. We're pointing right to it, and then away we go. Kind of slow right now because it's doing the entire simulation. You'll recall that we've got the gas resize fluid dynamic. Throw that in there. The default setting is pretty good in terms of initialization static. I like to delay it by a frame just so we can actually put something in there. So now when we play it, it'll wait a frame and then it'll contract down onto our thing. Now I also already know, and this is a good tip, this is going to be an explosion. It's going to move fast. So this padding setting, I'm going to bump it all the way up to 1. It's going to leave more space around it. And that'll allow this thing to explode and move out quickly without reaching the edge of the box by accident too soon. Cool. So we're not adding velocity in here, so I'm just going to turn that off. And just to make myself feel better, I'm going to put this to 0, although you definitely don't need to do that. But I'm doing it anyway. So it's going to source, right now it's sourcing these are the SOP volumes, and these are the simulation volume. So source volume density, add to field density. So if I press play again, middle click on this guy, you'll see I have a density field, also known as a volume. That's what this is referring to. Now on this side, it's saying source volume density. Now what is that referring to? Well, that is referring to the one from our source geometry node over here. If I middle click on this, that's this density. So it's looking it up by name. Now, why am I going through all that? Well, because I want to add temperature in. If I add it here, I'm going to say temperature volume is density. Density is going to add to the temperature field, and it's going to add to the density field. Now if I press play, watch what happens. Look at that. Now we got movement. Now we didn't add velocity into this or anything. What's happening here? Well, this is called buoyancy. Buoyancy is going to be a lot of what drives a simulation. You can see how broken up this is. We get this nice kind of churning pattern here because our input, and I can't stress this enough, the input is so important to how good your simulation is going to look. Because we have this evolving, chaotic source, we get this cool looking churning effect. And that right there is a cool effect. You might use that as for a smokestack or something. I don't know. But like, watch what happens If I go back to our fluid source and I say, you know what, don't use noise. Let's say you didn't believe me. I'm just going to turn the noise off. Watch how big a difference it makes. We have that initial shape here because the shape of the pig was irregular. It's also the heat is meeting cool air, and we're getting this mushrooming effect. Basically, whenever velocity is meeting an unmoving velocity, we're going to get that mushroom. But look, once the simulation gets going, now it's just boring. This is what it's going to look like now forever, because nothing's changing. Super lame. A good way to visualize any of this stuff is literally on the Visualizer tab on the smoke object. There's a velocity here. Look at that. You can see it. The temperature drives buoyancy, which is an upwards movement. It's literally going to add an upwards velocity where there's heat. And then it just kind of evens out after a while and gets boring. We can even look at a temperature field. Let's turn off density. And look at that. Now we're just viewing the temperature being added into the system at this slice of the volume. These colors that determine is what's referred to as black body radiation, where we have things that are cold are black, things that are hot are white, and then there's kind of a gradient from red to yellow. So black to red to yellow to white, which kind of approximates like thermal imaging scanners and, well, really just fire in general. Cool. So I'm going to turn the density back on. Here it is. And I'm also going to turn the noise back on, of course, because we're never going to want to be without that. So, of course, we lose the cache because we changed some stuff, but that's fine. We can get it back if we want to. Still simulating pretty fast. This is the actual bounds of the sim. This is the maximum bounds of our sim. So we've been talking about buoyancy, and what buoyancy means here is where there is temperature, it's going to add a upward vector for velocity into the sim. So this is going to be the very first of our Pyrus solver stuff going on here, and we're going to find that here on the simulation tab under buoyancy lift and buoyancy direction. So it's only an upward vector actually because we're selling it to be an upward vector. We could do something really stupid like, oh, I don't know. Let's say we want it to buoyancy for some reason to correspond to X. So now you can see it's blowing to the right. Doesn't make any sense, but you could do that. I can't even honestly imagine a reason why you'd want to do that. Maybe you drive this parameter with something. Got some weird movie you're working on where gravity's all crazy. At any rate, so keep that to this usually. Buoyancy lift here, I mean, you can go extreme. At 50, it's going to really shoot up. Like, look how hot that is. Now that's more like a steam shooting out of a pipe, maybe, you know, especially down here. Obviously, we don't want this either. Some of this will have to do with, you will change this somewhat. It's going to have to do with the scale of your simulation. So obviously 50 is too fast. Even 5 might have been too fast. So I'm thinking like 2. At 2, that's not going to rise quite as crazily. Anytime you have a simulation moving slower, like a smoke sim moving slower, that kind of gives it a sense of scale. It usually means that it feels bigger. Because you figure, if the rate at which something would move up into the sky, or think of it in terms of gravity, if you see something falling and it's falling quickly, you're probably close by. Whereas if you saw something in the distance falling, it's going to move slower relative to the camera. So anytime something's moving slower in a simulation, it tends to give offer the effect of a much larger scale. So we see some interesting properties here. The column in the middle continues to churn forth. I'm going to bring the temperature back here, because we keep adding temperature into it, so it keeps going. But this little area over here, watch how he stops. He goes up with everybody else, and then he kind of just hangs out. And why is that? That's because it's cooling off. The temperature actually cools off in the simulation. Again, completely arbitrary, and that's also here. The cooling rate is 0.75. And as the helper text helpfully points out, and I have to keep constantly bringing this up, the higher it is, the more of it will actually remove. So if you said something like 0, it'll actually never cool off. Nothing in the simulation will cool off. And it's just going to rise forever. You won't see that thing stop this time. It might be diffused a little bit. This temperature diffusion will blur the temperature out a little bit, so it actually still will probably slow down somewhat, but it won't slow down as drastically as it did last time. So it's only, quote, cooling off in the sense that it's spreading out in this case. But you can still definitely see how it's still going up with everybody else largely. The opposite would apply as well. If we went to some crazy amount like this, it should... You'll still have some movement only because we're adding temperature in every frame. So it's still doing that buoyancy calculation on the heat that it just added. But obviously it's barely moving now. I mean, it's really going nowhere fast. So these are extreme rates. The default was 0.75. I would say I'm going to do 0.5. The reason why I'm going to do 0.5 is because I don't want it to cool off the fire that's coming quite as fast. The flames that are generated from the fuel plus temperature combustion are completely subject to the cooling rate as well. So by putting it at 0.5, I'm going to ensure a couple of things. One is that my simulation is pretty active, and also that the actual fire itself won't burn out too fast. Now, there's lots of different ways to control lots of these things, but this is again, I'm showing you the way that I usually do it. I think that this is a pretty good way of going forward on this. Great. Oh yeah, I always forget that. This dissipation is here too. Turn that off. We'll add our own dissipation and evaporation like microsolver later on.